So welcome to week 2, the strange story of Daniel. For anyone who doesn't have a sheet, I think they're back there by the hot water. A reminder once again for people to please silence their cell phones, as well as if anyone is not already getting the emails, although looking around I think that everyone here is on the email list for the class. But if you're not, let me know. I would like to make sure to add you. We said last week we're talking about strange stories of heroes and villains, miracles, divine reward and punishment. So last week was, I suppose, a reward story, as we saw the rescue of Daniel's friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah from the furnace. We talked about its impact, the impact of that story on martyrdom in Judaism. This time around, we're going to be talking punishment. And we're talking about the punishment of one of the worst villains in Tanakh, certainly in terms of body count, and that is King Nevuchadnezzar of Babylon. Now, in order to introduce this, we have to go to a text that is before the book of Daniel, in order to get a real sense of what Nebuchadnezzar was responsible for, who exactly it is that we're talking about. We already introduced him as a very cruel person last week when we saw his threat to his advisors, if you can't tell me what I dreamed, and what it means, right, the threat to have him torn into small pieces. Well, take a look at source number 1, which is one of the texts in Tanakh that describes Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Jerusalem. The invasion of Jerusalem took place over a period of time. Right, you're talking basically, I think, 18 years all told for the entire process. But the leadership of the Jews of Judea are exiled 11 years before the temple is destroyed. And as part of this series of invasions, we find Nebuchadnezzar come through, take what he wants, kill whomever he wants, exile whomever he wants, and depose the king, and put in place a new king who he felt would be amenable to him, who would pay the tribute, who would listen, and not cause trouble. That was standard for conquest in those days. It was what they did. So take a look at source number 1 from Malachim Bet, the book of Kings, from one such invasion at the time when Tzidkiyahu was the king of Judea. He is known as the last king of Judea. They captured the king, Tzidkiyahu in the Hebrew, Zedekiah in the English, which has a certain ring to it, but I'm going to stick with Tzidkiyahu. Anyway, they captured the king and brought him before the king of Babylon, that's Nebuchadnezzar, at Rivlah. And they put him on trial. They slaughtered Tzidkiyahu's sons before his eyes. Then Tzidkiyahu's eyes were put out. And if you ever look at Rembrandt's picture of Jeremiah mourning for Jerusalem, you can see Tzidkiyahu there in the portrait. He was chained in bronze fetters and he was brought to Babylon. On the 7th day of the 5th month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. This is the 7th day of the 5th month, parenthetically. What's the 5th month in the Jewish calendar? Diane's doing the math. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, Tammuz, Av. Right? The 9th of Av gets credit for the destruction of the temple, but we begin our description here with the 7th day of the month for reasons that are not going to be for right now. But the 7th day of the 5th month, it's in the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards, an officer of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the king's palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. He burned down the house of every notable person. The entire Chaldean force. The Chaldeans are not quite identical with Babylonians, but for our purposes they are. The entire Chaldean force that was with the chief of the guards tore down the walls of Jerusalem on every side. The remnant of the people that was left in the city, the defectors who had gone over to the king of Babylon, and the remnant of the population were taken into exile by Nebuzaradan, the chief of the guards. Murder, destruction, barbarity on a grand scale, but preceded here with the story of one human being, the king, who has to see his sons killed, and then he himself is blinded and taken away in chains. That's one of the description of what we're talking about. I also brought you, just for a little bit of of additional material. Source number 2, from Josephus. Right? We've talked about Josephus before. A Jew living at the time of the Roman conquest of Jerusalem. He himself is the general leader of a fortress. He is the sole survivor of the Roman assault on that fortress. The rest of them commit suicide rather than be captured by the Romans. There is debate as to how it is that he survived. Was it just the way things worked out, or did he actually plan the mass suicide in such a way that he would survive? That causes some questions regarding the credibility of the things that he says and writes afterwards, because he becomes an ally of the Romans, and he seeks to curry favor with them as he writes records of Jewish history. And so whenever you read him, you have to know that there's an angle in what he's writing. Well, here, he talks about the Babylonian destruction of the first temple, and he says the following.
But he's writing this years later, right?
Oh, much later. Yeah. No, he's writing this late 1st century Common Era. The temple in Jerusalem, by the secular historical count, occurred in the year 586 before the Common Era. So you're talking 600 plus years later. Now, a little time afterward, he says, after an earlier part of the Babylonian invasion, the king of Babylon made an expedition against Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim was the king who preceded Tzidkiyahu. So he made an expedition against Jehoiakim, whom he received, meaning Jehoiakim received Nevuchadnezzar into the city, out of fear of the foregoing predictions of this prophet of Jeremiah, as supposing he should suffer nothing that was terrible, because he neither shut the gates nor fought against him. Wiston's translation is great compared to the original Greek. However, it's a little hard to read as English. So just to explain, Jeremiah the prophet had predicted the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians and said, don't bother fighting. It's not going to do you any good, and this is the will of God. And so King Jehoiakim thinks, okay, I'm going to welcome Nebuchadnezzar into the city. I'm not going to put up a fight, and therefore, it'll all be okay. He was good until he got to the part of, and we'll all be okay. Yet when Nebuchadnezzar was come into the city, he did not observe the covenants he had made, but he slew such as were in the flower of their age, and such as were of the greatest dignity, together with their king Jehoiakim, whom he commanded to be thrown before the walls without any burial. He made his son Jehoiachin king of the country and of the city. He also took the principal persons in dignity for captives, 3,000 in number, and led them away to Babylon. That was when Daniel was taken to Babylon, was in that group of leaders who were taken. So this gives us a sense of who Nebuchadnezzar is, the kind of barbarity we're talking about, which may have been routine at a certain point in human history. But this is the guy who we're dealing with, and the question that certainly I think about as I read this is, what's God going to do to him for this? Right? We know what God does to Pharaoh. Right? What's God going to do to Nebuchadnezzar as punishment for this kind of conduct? So that's what we're going to see this morning. Are we clear? Understood? Okay. So, the story we're going to read begins at the end of the 3rd chapter of the book of Daniel. Remember, we've said this before, the chapter breaks are not Jewish in origin. The chapter breaks were a gift of the Catholic Church. And as a result, they sometimes don't quite match thematically the stories, for a variety of reasons depending on the case. And here our story actually starts at the end of the 3rd chapter with a letter sent by King Nebuchadnezzar. And indeed the entire chapter is going to be Nebuchadnezzar telling a story that happened to him. So if you think of a movie where they have a narrator telling the story, kind of as a voiceover, that's what's going on here. Which means that your style is going to be a little clumsy. It's this person speaking of what happened to him and choosing to be repetitious in areas where that feels right to him, choosing to emphasize the parts he wants to emphasize, play down the parts he doesn't want to emphasize. Nancy, you ready to say? No? Okay, sorry, wrong read. So it starts in quotes in source number 3. Actually, before we read that or after? I think we'll read it first and then we'll go with the sources I brought afterwards. In my notes it's flipped, but we'll see how this goes. Take a look at source number 3, the opening of the letter. King Nevuchadnezzar, to all people and nations of every language that inhabit the whole earth, may your well-being abound. The signs and wonders that the Most High God, that will be ours, has worked for me, I am pleased to relate. How great are His signs, how mighty His wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and His dominion endures throughout the generations. That is the beginning of his letter, describing what happened to him in this chapter. Which tells you that whatever it was that had happened to him in this chapter must have been something. Right? I mean, here you have the slaughterer of thousands and this cruel butcher of a person saying, the signs and wonders that the God of the Jews has worked for me, I am pleased to relate. And I'm going to send this letter to the entire earth. I want everybody to know what it was that happened, how great are His signs, how mighty are His wonders, His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and so on. It's really fascinating. Yes? You got it. Excellent. Diane points out that these words are familiar. They actually appear in Tehillim. They appear in Psalms. Chapter 145, also known as Ashrei. Right? Although 145 technically doesn't begin with Ashrei. But yes, the line that begins with the letter Mem in Ashrei, Malchutcha, Malchut kol olamim, u'memshaltecha b'chol dor v'dor. There's even a neat song with it, right? It means exactly this. Now, Tehillim, Psalms, far precedes Nevuchadnezzar. So, Psalms is long before Nebuchadnezzar. Psalms is associated with King David and even some of it with earlier writers. That's the other end of the temple period. He's centuries before. But what it means is either somebody has taught Nebuchadnezzar these words, or he has some kind of inspiration which hits him in the same way that David was inspired to write Psalms. But unquestionably, this is intentional. The only difference is, hang on one second, Ricky. The only difference is that Daniel is written in Aramaic. And therefore what you'll see if you were looking at it in the original would be an Aramaic version of what appears in Psalms. That's the difference. But it's actually going to appear twice here. Once in the beginning of the story, and then again at the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar reiterates it. Ricky, yes.
I lost the thread. Who is writing this letter?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Himself.
Himself.
To whom?
To all people and nations of every language that inhabit the whole earth. Everybody is an audience to Nebuchadnezzar. And generally speaking, that's a wise idea. You better listen when he speaks. But this story that we're about to read has to be read not in a vacuum, but in light of what came before it. The immediately preceding story was the story in which Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into the fiery furnace. The story before that, remember, was the great big gold statue. Well, that story was the great big gold statue. The story before it was his dream, when he was frightened about this vision of the statue with the different materials and the possibility that his empire is going to be destroyed. So Don Isaac Abarbanel makes the point in source number 4. He says he, Nebuchadnezzar, thought that he would erase the heavenly decree and arrange the earthly empires such that they would be humbled and enslaved before him and his seed forever. We talked about this. How Nebuchadnezzar thinks Babylon forever, a full gold statue. Due to this empty arrogance, it was decreed that he would be chased from human society to travel like a wild donkey among the beasts, which is where we're going with this story. Whatever's going to happen to him here is a response in some way to what he did there. That's the idea. Okay. The other piece that I wanted to show you is just Ibn Ezra here in source number 5. Rabbi Avram Ibn Ezra says what I've already mentioned, which is the letter tells the entire story that happened. It was written thus here in honor of Daniel. For the king wrote thus to all the lands of his reign, and it was a great source of splendor for Israel. In other words, he's paying tribute to Daniel. You'll see how he figures into the story. And to the God of the Jews by writing this letter. There may be another reason for him to send this letter. Once we've seen the story, we'll understand there's an additional motivation here in this. Elaine. By the way, there are seats. There are a few seats here for anyone who came in. Like, you don't have to be buried in the back. Yes.
Nebuchadnezzar, king.
Yeah.
What was his vision of the whole world at that time? What was the whole world?
Right. That's a really good question. What is the world to Nevuchadnezzar at this point in human history? And the answer clearly is it doesn't involve North America, South America. Like that whole hemisphere is not in his scope. It's possible that there were those who knew the world was round, because we know that that's not a late discovery. That was known long before Columbus's journey. But no, he's thinking Europe, North Africa is known certainly at that point. Asia. How far into Asia? How far east have Europeans gone at that point? I don't know. But that's basically what he's aware of. That's more or less the sphere of his influence. He is a dominant emperor, the Western Hemisphere is not part of this picture. And the general understanding, I believe, that they had at this point was that human beings couldn't live too far south. That if you went too far south in Africa, the climate was such that you couldn't survive. Remember, this is before air conditioning, so there's something to be said for that worldview. Right. Okay. So, that brings us to the start of the story. Now we know a little bit of background, right? This is after the events that we talked about last week. We understand that there's supposed to be some kind of cause and effect going on between what happened in chapter 3 and what's happening in chapter 4. He suddenly is converted to something. He wants to honor the God of the Jews. No, he never converts to Judaism. But let's take a look at the start of the story, which I brought here in source number 6. I adapt the JPS translation again because it's available for cutting and pasting online. You can look at other translations. You'll see it to be fairly similar. I, Nevuchadnezzar, was living serenely in my house, flourishing in my palace. I had a dream that frightened me, and my thoughts in bed and the vision of my mind alarmed me. Right? He had another dream. Nebuchadnezzar ought to be laying off the pizza before bed. I gave an order to bring all the wise men of Babylon before me to let me know the meaning of the dream. The magicians, they translate here exorcists for one of the Aramaic words, maybe. Chaldeans and diviners came. And I related the dream to them, but they could not make its meaning known to me. So here, he's become nicer. You see, he's mellowed. He told them what the dream was, and he just asked them to explain what it means. Finally, Daniel called Belteshazzar after the name of my God. Right? We talked about how they've given the Babylonian names associated with their deity to the Jews in the court. So he says, this fellow Daniel, Belteshazzar, in whom the spirit of the holy gods was, came to me. And I related the dream to him, saying, Belteshazzar, chief magician, in whom I know the spirit of the holy gods to be, and whom no mystery baffles, tell me the meaning of my dream vision that I have seen. In the visions of my mind, in bed, I saw a tree of great height in the midst of the earth. The tree grew and became mighty. Its top reached heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. So he's gone from statues to trees. Okay. Its foliage was beautiful, its fruit abundant. There was food for all in it. Beneath it, the beasts of the field found shade, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches. All creatures fed on it. In the vision of my mind in bed, I looked and saw a holy watcher coming down from heaven. The image of the holy watcher, the term in Aramaic is Irin. Irin Kadishin. For those who sing the song on Shabbat, Karibon, which is Aramaic, a lot of its Aramaic actually comes from the book of Daniel. Irin Kadishin. Kadishin is from the word Kadosh. It means holy. Irin comes from the word air. Air meaning to be alert, to be awake. A whole bunch of words in Hebrew are associated with that. The word Ir, as in a city, comes from that because it's generally an exposed town as opposed to one with a wall. So it's open. Erva is another word that's associated with it. So here, this watcher is an angel that is alert, a holy being that is looking down. So this angel comes down from heaven, He called loudly and said, "Hew down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its foliage, scatter its fruit. Let the beasts of the field flee from beneath it, and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground. In fetters of iron and bronze, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and share earth's verdure." Is it verdure?
Yeah.
I've only read it. No one ever says it. With the beasts, its greenery. Yeah. Let his mind be altered from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of a beast, and let 7 seasons pass over him. This sentence is decreed by the watchers. This verdict is commanded by the holy ones, so that all creatures may know that the Most High is sovereign over the realm of man, and He gives it to whom He wishes, and He may set over it even the lowest of men. I, King Nevuchadnezzar, had this dream. Now you, Belshazzar, tell me its meaning, since all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make its meaning known to me, but you are able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in you. Okay. Question time. Do you know what this dream means? Before you read any further, before you hear any more of the story, do you know what this dream means? Nebuchadnezzar is in trouble. Who is the tree? How do you know?
Because he controls everything.
Right. It's big, it's tall, it's in control of everything. Everybody benefits from it. Everybody shelters beneath it. This is clearly a vision of King Nebuchadnezzar himself. Right? That's fairly transparent as dream imagery goes. Statue, maybe I couldn't have gotten. Right? Gold, silver, bronze, maybe you can't figure that one out. But this one's actually relatively clear. That's number one. I mean, even take a look. I brought you here in source number 7 from the book of please.
This is not totally relevant, but the image of the image of the tree that got just a stump remaining.
Yes.
When this happens and a little bough starts, that is called Netzil.
Yes.
And the kibbutz where I grew up is called Netzil because it was established after the war,
right.
And it was founded by people who were saved. So his name is Nevuchadnezzar, and we have this word Netzil. That eventually that stump will grow.
Right. That's nice. But I would wager that they're probably not connected. No, the reason I say that is because the name Nebuchadnezzar has a very clear Babylonian etymology. Nebu, or Nebo, is one of their gods. Kad is when. Netzer is like Natar, also in Aramaic. It means to guard. To guard.
Yeah.
So it's Nebo is guarding. Or guardian by God. God is his guardian. God protect him. That kind of thing. So I'm not sure whether I would do that with Netzer as a shoot, but it's a beautiful image.
That is in the Bible, and from something a Netzer.
Right.
You don't
Yeah. No, you're thinking of Yeshaya, chapter 11 in Yeshaya. You got it. Okay, but let's go back here. Shh. Let's go back here. All true, and the importance of leaving the stump, which Ricky highlights, is going to come back to us. But take a look at source number 7, a completely different story, except that it involves a butcher, so I guess it's not entirely different. This is from the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, you get this terrible story about a man by the name of Avimelech, who wants power really, really badly enough that he kills all of his brothers, half-brothers really. But there are 70 of them, and he kills 69 of them, and only one of them escapes. And this one who escapes, his name is Yotam. And if you take a look at source number 7, you find what Yotam did. He calls out to the people of Shechem who have chosen his half-brother Avimelech as their leader, this murderous person as their leader, and look what happens. When Yotam was informed, when he was told what had happened, he went and stood on top of Mount Gerizim. And yes, Mount Gerizim has its own significance, but we're not really studying this story. I'm only bringing it to you for one reason, as you'll see. and he called out to them in a loud voice, "Citizens of Shechem," he cried, "listen to me that God may listen to you. Once the trees went to anoint a king over themselves. They said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.' But the olive tree replied, 'Have I, through whom God and man are honored, stopped yielding my rich oil that I should go wave above the trees? Why should I go become a king? I have work to do.' So the tree said to the fig tree, 'You should come reign over us.' So the fig tree said, 'If I stop yielding my sweetness, my delicious fruit, I should go and wave above the trees.' And the tree said to the grapevine, and the grapevine says, 'No way, I produce wine.' And finally the thorn bush. And the thorn bush says, 'Fine, but you should know, if you're going to betray me, may fire issue from the thorn bush and consume the cedars of Lebanon.'" It's a fascinating parable, this parable of the trees, but I bring it here simply to show you the image in Tanakh of the king as a tree. So without a doubt, we read this, and we know very well what this is saying. It's saying that Nevuchadnezzar is indeed in trouble. That it has been decreed in heaven that Nevuchadnezzar is going to be chopped down, and some sort of fate is going to befall him for this period of 7 seasons. Ruchama.
But what is interesting for me is in his dream, they will cut everything but not the woods.
Right, so we're going to come back to the stump. The stump is going to matter a great deal. Absolutely. Good eye. But the question I have for you is, why is it that the advisors can't explain the dream?
They don't want to. They're afraid of them.
It's not that they can, it's that they won't. Exactly. Everybody in the room, probably including Nebuchadnezzar, is well aware of what this dream says. The imagery is so clear-cut, so to speak. Abarbanel comments, he says, look, the branches are his children, those who are close to him in terms of his stature and his honor. The leaves are the armies, they're guarding the fruit. The fruit itself is the kingdom. The shade is the leadership of the nations who are under his care. It's so obvious that it's him. However, there's a lesson here also that is not as obvious, that I think is fascinating, that Abarbanel chooses to highlight here. It's a remarkable read, and once he says it, you look at it and say, well, of course. What was it that Nebuchadnezzar tried to create, to represent himself and his kingdom?
When he spoke to Daniel?
No, in the previous chapter. He created a statue of gold. Right? He created a statue of gold. Instead, he's being sent a tree. Among the differences between a statue of gold and a tree is that a tree grows old and ultimately dies. The statue of gold, the idea is permanence. If you take a look at source number 8, Abarbanel says, they showed him, the image that he's seeing here, is that man is a tree of the field, which of course is an expression from the Torah. Ki ha'adam eitz hasadeh. He is like that great, tall, beautiful tree, but he must likewise grow, exist, and then be destroyed. You thought you were going to last forever, but that's not the way it works, Nebuchadnezzar. Yes?
But on the other hand, a tree also expands.
Yeah, growth is good.
And it's
agreed.
Creates spores.
You bet. Better to be a tree than to be gold in some ways. Absolutely true. Go ask King Midas. Elaine.
Well, also the tree is the living thing.
Yeah.
And the statue is, just a hunk of innate.
Right. Well, there you get to the question of priorities. Right? Is it more important to him to be around forever or to live life? There are people who will answer one way, there are people who will answer another way. Nebuchadnezzar's vision so far, with his cruelty and the way he looks at the world, maybe he really wants to be around forever and he doesn't care what the price is. It's possible. Marilyn.
The last line in paragraph 6 sort of emphasizes the fact that he is frightened because he's overtly flattering. He's almost condescendingly. He's talking to a Jew here. Mm-hmm. Look what he's saying to him. You're able, you're a spirit. I mean, he's talking to him almost on a one-to-one basis where he is the king. So, this is a man who's afraid of something.
Right. There's definitely fear here. I mean, his respect for Daniel began at the end of the previous chapter. Not the previous one, sorry. Began at the end of chapter 2 when Daniel explained his dream of the statue. That was when he elevated him to a position of power. He starts to respect him. But you're right. I think you're right. There's a sense here that Nebuchadnezzar is needy in this story. So let's take a look at what happens. Source number 9 gives us the continuation of the story. Then Daniel called Belshazzar. Remember, this is still Nebuchadnezzar telling the story. When you see phrases repeated, like we keep insisting, Daniel called Belshazzar, like I got it the first time. He's going to keep on doing it because that's what Nebuchadnezzar's thought process is, and it's the way he expresses himself. This fellow Daniel, who I have named Belshazzar, was perplexed for a while and alarmed by his thoughts. Now, interestingly, the Aramaic for it is ishtomim kisha'achada. Ishtomim, like a word that you find in Hebrew as well, shamim shmama, means to be desolate, to be in ruins. The ishtomim is the Aramaic form of it. It's actually a phrase.
To be surprised.
That's slightly different. But the term here is from shmama, which is to say desolation. It actually makes it into the Talmud in a few different places. The term ishtomim, the phrase ishtomim kisha'achada, when a sage in the Talmud is asked a question and he has no idea what the answer is, they use this phrase from the book of Daniel. So Daniel doesn't have a response, but it's not because he doesn't know. Everybody knows. It's because he's a little afraid to say this to the king. Now, if you're familiar with Tanakh, you know prophets have to say things to the king all the time that the king doesn't like. Rabbi Yaakov Meidana, though, makes an interesting point. Rabbi Yaakov Meidana is a rabbi in Yeshivat Har Etzion in Israel. And he's written on the book of Daniel. And one point that he addresses here is a much bigger point in general about Daniel. And largely academic, but worth taking a moment to recognize it. Tanakh is divided up into 3 sections. There is Torah, there is Nevi'im, and there is Ketuvim, the word that we use. Tanakh is an acronym. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Torah is the Chumash, the 5 books, Pentateuch. Nevi'im, the prophets. Ketuvim, the writings. So the prophets includes the history that we have of what happened after the Jews entered Israel. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. As well as the prophets from the end of the First Temple period. So the big famous ones, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, that's there. As well as smaller books of prophecy like the book of Jonah. Those are all there in Nevi'im, in the prophets. And then you have Ketuvim, the writings. The writings includes the Megillot, the book of Esther, the book of Eicha, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. Those are there. Ezra, Nehemiah, the book of Chronicles, these history works from the beginning of the Second Temple period are there as well. Tehillim, Psalms are in the writings. Mishlei, Proverbs are in the writings, and Daniel is there as well. And so the big classic question is, why do I have divisions? I understand Chumash is different. God speaks to Moses. Fine. That's its own league. But why do we have prophets versus writings? So one answer that's offered, excuse me a moment. One answer that's offered is that the prophets have a higher level of access to God than the authors of the writings. Meaning, prophecy is a message God gives somebody, which may be more clear or less clear, may involve a message that's a verbal message, may involve pictures and images, but it's considered a message from God. That's why we look at Nevi'im, prophets. The writings tend to be what's called Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, meaning the person is writing in a human way. And what they're writing are their own thoughts, boosted by God, as Maimonides describes it. That God is giving them access to higher strength, a greater strength than they would have had, but it's fundamentally their words. That's one way to divide up prophets and writings. But there's another key distinction between the prophets and the writings. And that is, a prophet has a mission. The job of a prophet is to speak to somebody. The very word Navi, at its base, is either associated with the word Niv, which means speech, Niv Sfatayim, or Lehavi, to bring. There's debate about the etymology, but either way, It's a mission of go tell someone something. That's what prophets are supposed to do. Whereas Ketuvim is not about, here's a text that you're supposed to convey to somebody. It's an inspiration sent to the writer that the writer then chooses to write down and ultimately will be shared. But it's not about go tell this. Daniel never has a mission of go tell this to somebody. His prophecies, generally speaking, are actually supposed to be sealed. He's told at one point, make this unintelligible to the masses. And he succeeds. He's not supposed to tell it to anybody, so he's not really a prophet in that sense of having to convey a message to others. So Rabbi Meidan, now completing the circuit, Rabbi Meidan says that's why, with all the prophets and all the frightening things they had to tell kings and all the bad things they had to say, right, where Isaiah will come to a king and rebuke him directly and say, your kingdom is going to collapse. Jeremiah spends his whole life doing that. And we don't find them back off and say, I'm afraid to go to the king. Occasionally a little bit, you find some hesitancy. But generally not. Daniel isn't the prophet. God has not told Daniel, go tell this to King Nevuchadnezzar. The only thing he has is the king coming to him and saying, can you tell me what this dream means? And Daniel is operating as his own man, thinking, actually, I'd prefer to sit this one out. And God hasn't told me to say anything. So if all's equal to you, I'd rather not say anything. But of course he knows he doesn't have a choice. He does have to give an explanation. He can try lying, but if he gets caught, he's going to be in trouble. And he will get caught, because that's the way things work. So take a look at source number 9. Daniel is perplexed and alarmed. The king addressed him. Let the dream and its meaning not alarm you. The king says, don't worry, just tell me. He knows exactly what's going on. Well, Belshazzar replied, my lord, would that the dream were for your enemy and its meaning for your foe. Right? May this happen to the enemy. May this not happen to you. Now, there's a side note here that's worth noting the Midrash is bothered by, right? Which is, who is Nebuchadnezzar's enemy?
Him?
That would be us. He doesn't really want to wish this on Nebuchadnezzar's enemy. So the Midrash has this very cute image of Daniel turning to the king and saying, my lord, and he turns away to God. In his own mind, he's turning away to God and saying, would that the dream would be for your enemy. Meaning Nebuchadnezzar. He's wishing it upon Nebuchadnezzar, right? Let God, keep the czar, right? Far away, like that kind of thing going on here. The tree that you saw grow and become mighty, whose top reached heaven, which was visible throughout the earth, whose foliage was beautiful, whose fruit was so abundant, and there was food for all in it, beneath which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the sky lodged. It is you, O king. You have grown and become mighty, whose greatness has grown to reach heaven, whose dominion is to the end of the earth. The holy watcher, whom the king saw descend from heaven and say, hew down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and fetters of iron and bronze in the grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and share the lot of the beasts of the field until 7 seasons pass over him. Well, this is its meaning, O king. It is the decree of the Most High, which has overtaken my lord the king. You will be driven away from men, and have your habitation with the beasts of the field. You will be fed grass like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 seasons will pass over you, until you come to know that the Most High is sovereign over the realm of man, and He gives it to whom He wishes. And the meaning of the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots is that the kingdom will remain yours from the time you come to know that heaven is sovereign. Your monarchy is waiting for you. Therefore, O king, may my advice be acceptable to you. Redeem your sins by beneficence, and your iniquities by generosity to the poor, then your serenity may be extended. All this befell King Nebuchadnezzar.
All this meaning all these events?
All of these events. The whole bit. You notice something interesting. I heard everybody flip the page. But in his description here of what's going to happen, right? Actually, let me see. It's an insight into the Aramaic. I'm going to skip that. But one note that is in here that's worth noting. Did you notice the animal that he mentioned? he had said here, hang on. Right, he had said shed a lot of the beasts of the field, but no, you know what? It's not. It's funny. The English sort of skips it, but no. In the original Aramaic, in sentence 21, he's actually told he's going to be like an ox, which wasn't in his original vision. Right. The Abarbanel notes the dream didn't mention an ox, but the idea is that the ox is really powerful and it's an herbivore. It's going to eat the grass of the field. If you look at sentence 2, Pasuk Bet, you'll see it there. It can be a beast of burden, but I think the image of power is what he wants to convey to Nevuchadnezzar. You're going to be a beast, but it's an ox. At least you'll be an ox. So it's going to take him 7 seasons in order to go through this. Whether that means it's going to take 7 seasons for Nebuchadnezzar to recognize God, or that it means God is going to make him unable to recognize him for 7 seasons. He's going to be an animal for 7 seasons. At the end of that time, God will allow him to again return to his mind. But that's what happens. That's the vision for Nebuchadnezzar. But one thing that's perplexing in this, Daniel did one thing that was very strange. Right? What did he do at the end?
Release the stuff.
No. What did he do? What did Daniel do? He
gave advice.
Right, Warren says that he gave him advice. He gave him advice.
Oh, he told him what to do.
He told him, right? He said, "May my advice be acceptable to you. Redeem your sins by beneficence, your iniquities by generosity to the poor. Give tzedakah," he says.
This is what a Navi would do.
Well, it's certainly more like what prophets do, right? They give counsel. This is true. Sorry, Linda? Yosef did it. Very good. Yosef does this when it comes to Pharaoh, right? And the answer may well be that this is supporting the throne. Even when the throne is despicable, nonetheless, the role of the Jew in exile is that he's going to give counsel to the throne. There's somebody else who did it, whose story is coming up in the Jewish calendar. Esther, Esther not so much, but Mordechai. Right? Mordechai finds out about the plot against King Ahasuerus, and in the end of chapter 2 there, he sends the message to Esther with it. Esther tells the king, saves the king's life, ends up leading to a nice parade through the city, ultimately for Mordechai, aggravating Haman, fits into the story nicely. But the image is of supporting the throne. That may be. What else might motivate him to do it?
I think he wants to get out of there alive.
So let me give him a silver lining type of a thing. Let me at least give him some positive message that'll go with it. Look, here's a way out. That could be. It also could be that it's inherent in the task of dream interpretation. Right? You're not just asking, tell me what this is, but tell me what I can do about it. It could be that this is the way that he perceives his role. Rashi gives a fascinating explanation. If you flip the page now to number 10. Rashi, based on a midrash, asks, what moved Daniel to give this good advice to Nebuchadnezzar? And the answer is, he looked to who's going to receive the charity. He saw the Jews, poor, lowly in their exile, going from door to door. And he advised Nebuchadnezzar to aid them. He said, these paupers you exiled are hungry. Support them. And so Nebuchadnezzar did, opening his stores and supporting them for 12 months. That Daniel was doing this, it's a self-serving thing. It's an attempt to help the Jews. It's not about, Nebuchadnezzar, I feel terrible for you. Let me help you avoid this punishment. No, as far as that's concerned, I'm going to be laughing all the way. But I want to see if I can help others with this. One other take on Isaac Abarbanel in source number 11. He suggests that, and this is part of a theme we're going to come back to and develop more, that Nebuchadnezzar is being punished for his arrogance. If so, for him to go try to support the needy is a correction. There's an element of kapara, there's an element of atonement by giving tzedakah here. Yeah, that may be what's going on. However, With all of the different explanations we've given for Daniel's motivation, whether he's doing it in order to try to put a positive spin on things and save himself, or whether it's because he wants to support the throne as Joseph does with Pharaoh, as Mordechai and Esther do with Ahasuerus, whether it's because he views this as part of dream interpretation, whether it's a plan to help the Jewish captives in Babylon, whether it's atonement for arrogance, however you read it, the sages didn't like it. They felt that Daniel ultimately is punished for this. As I brought you in source number 12 from the Talmud, Daniel is punished because he advised King Nevuchadnezzar. You're not supposed to do that. God wants him to get zapped, let him get zapped. Or, hang on, as Rabbi MordechaI says in source number 13, this is really just a fig leaf for Nevuchadnezzar. You can't simply give tzedakah and whitewash massacres. It doesn't work that way. Rabbi MordechaI in source number 13 says, perhaps this was Daniel's sin. He did not entirely clarify his words to Nebuchadnezzar, and he planted with Nebuchadnezzar the feeling that the tzedakah he would distribute to the needy would pacify divine wrath at his arrogance. Can one who sins with arrogance then bribe the one who neither shows favor nor accepts bribes? In other words, the problem is, you didn't cause tshuva, you didn't cause repentance. All you did was get him to make a donation. That's not appropriate advice. If you had given him better advice, it would have been fine. Moshe.
But, the mention of Yosef is what I was thinking about that. Daniel seems to be very much like Yosef, who was also savaged by rabbis. And he seems to have an understanding of the timeline of Judaism. Like Yosef understands...
Who savages Yosef for advising Pharaoh? I don't recall that.
You just mentioned it.
No, Daniel gets savaged. Yosef does not.
The rabbis are critical of Yosef.
Where?
In how he responds to the...
No. Where is the criticism?
He's in jail.
His years in jail are before that. His years in jail are not after that. He's out of jail at that point. All right, I'll tell you what, because we're short on time. We both have homework. Mine is going to be to send out a link, because I have a class that I gave on the link between Joseph, Daniel, and Esther, and their conduct in the palace. So I'm going to send out a link to that so you can hear that. Your job is going to be to find for me a source that the rabbi savaged Joseph for helping Pharaoh, because I'm not familiar and I want to know. Oh, okay. Then we're good. But only from before, not for what he does with Pharaoh. Okay, we're going to go further, and I apologize, but at this point, with 13 minutes left, I'm going to talk and ask you to hold the questions and comments for the end. Hopefully, there will be time, but we have to get through this story. We now know that Daniel has given him the warning. He has interpreted the dream. He has advised him to give tzedakah, to give charity, and Nebuchadnezzar does for a period of a year. But then, source number 14. The rest of the story. 12 months later, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace at Babylon, kings don't walk on the roof, it doesn't go well. The king exclaimed, "There is great Babylon, which I have built by my vast power to be a royal residence for the glory of my majesty." Little arrogant? The words were still on the king's lips when a voice fell from heaven. "It has been decreed for you, O King Nebuchadnezzar. The kingdom has passed out of your hands. You are being driven away from men. Your habitation is to be with the beasts of the field. You are to be fed grass like cattle. 7 seasons will pass over you until you come to know that the Most High is sovereign over the realm of man, and He gives it to whom He wishes," just as Daniel had said. There and then, the sentence was carried out upon Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from men. He ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like eagle's feathers, and his nails like the talons of birds. Eagle may not be the translation there. It may be vulture. But that's a different discussion for another time. When the time had passed, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason was restored to me. I blessed the Most High and praised and glorified the ever-living One, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion and whose kingdom endures throughout the generations. There you go, Diane. That's the second appearance of that line. All the inhabitants of the earth are of no account. He does as he wishes with the host of heaven and with the inhabitants of the earth. There is none to stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Which is a line that makes it into Jewish liturgy as well. There and then my reason was restored to me, and my majesty and splendor were restored to me for the glory of my kingdom. My companions and nobles sought me out, and I was reestablished over my kingdom, and added greatness was given me. So now I, Nevuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heaven, all of whose works are just, and whose ways are right, and who is able to humble those who behave arrogantly. Okay, a few things here in this. First of all, yes, he gave tzedakah, but now apparently he's stopped. If you take a look at source number 15, which was the basis for the Rashi that we saw in 10, Midrash says, the wicked one opened his stores and distributed to the people for 12 months. After 12 months, the wicked one forgot the dream. He began to stroll atop his palace. It doesn't mean he forgot literally the dream. It means that, the way things work, things lose their intensity. He began to stroll atop his palace where he heard the cries of the poor masses before his still open stores. He asked his servants, what is the sound I hear? They said, the paupers you exile, they're demanding their support. A stingy eye entered him, and the king replied, this is great Babylon, which I built to house a palace with my strength and my glory, that line that we saw in 14. He said, without my stores, how could I build up this entire land? I need my money. He decreed that the aid be halted. As the text continues, the word was still in the king's mouth, etc. God said to him, wicked one, what caused your peace all 12 months? It was the tzedakah you practiced. And if this happens to the nations, we close the Midrash with a warning. If this happens to the nations, meaning for not giving, how much more so for Israel, we should take a hint from that as well. Okay, there's a fun debate that goes on in the commentators as to what exactly happened to Nebuchadnezzar. If you read this text, right, it sounds like there's a physical transformation. Right? His hair grows long, his nails are like talons. So the question is, what actually happened? The Christians in general love the book of Daniel, for reasons we've sort of hinted at a little bit. They were of the belief that it was actual transformation. Like he actually became an animal. It isn't just growing his hair and his nails, but he actually became an animal. Don Isaac of Barbanel thought that was really funny. He said, first of all, if he became an animal, then how did he come to think of God? Now, you could answer, maybe he only became an animal for the 7 seasons, and then afterwards God restores him to mind. Maybe. Second problem, how come nobody took over the throne? How did he get back on the throne after 7 seasons were done? Somebody's running the government at that point and isn't going to like it when he comes back if he's been an animal all this time. Further, Barbanel notes, on a more prosaic level, oxen don't actually have toenails. They don't. We did a fetal pig dissection when I was in university, right? They also don't have toenails. They don't have nails. So what do you mean his nails grew? So he says, come on, this isn't meant to be literal. Take a look at source number 16, Don Isaac of Barbanel's explanation. Fascinating. In truth, miraculously, suddenly, extraordinary quantities of black bile overcame him. What is black bile in medieval times? In their biology.
In your tummy.
No, bile is a fluid, but it means depression. Marash chora in Hebrew. This was their biological explanation for depression, and it had been going way, way back to the Greeks. This isn't our invention as an idea. But what he's doing, Barbanel says that's what happened. Such that he rejected human society and fled from it, dwelling in the wilderness, rejecting royal food and palaces, sofas of gold and silver, which I would add are pretty uncomfortable anyway. He elected to travel alone all day and all night, estranged in the fields, to the point that his radiance and appearance darkened. His hair and nails grew very long, and his food was the grass of the field as the food of beasts, as solitary desert wanderers eat. His heart, which had once been wise, was changed from the heart of human beings through his illness and the growth of darkness in him. His heart and thoughts were not those of people, certainly not those of a king. His heart was like that of a beast in him, drawn to his desires without any concern for intellectual or pragmatic thought. But because everyone saw him, he was not thought to be dead, but only ill or antisocial and rejecting association with human beings. And so his servants did not rebel against him, and no one reigned in his stead. Right? You know his reputation. No one sits on Nebuchadnezzar's throne until they see a sword run through him. No, you just don't do that. So that's why the throne remains. But Abarbanel and Ibn Ezra before Abarbanel in the 11th century already said this as well, saw this as some kind of depressed episode that Nebuchadnezzar experiences, and he is driven out into the wild as a result, but ultimately he is able to return to power. And here I quote Abarbanel again in source number 17, and this is the piece about leaving the trunk, leaving the roots. He was not removed from his empire entirely, as would have suited his wickedness. As it said, leave the essence of his roots in the ground. For two reasons. First, due to the divine decree that the monarchy of Nebuchadnezzar, his lifetime and those of his son and grandson would be 70 years. As Yirmiyahu said, the prophet Jeremiah, and they will serve him, his son and his grandson, until the time for his land comes. So number one, there's a prophecy that we are to be in exile for 70 years. If Nebuchadnezzar loses the throne, that's going to disrupt the Babylonian reign and potentially disrupt this prophecy. The second reason is that God restored his mind and reign so that divine might could be publicized. And this is the more authentic reason, I think, because if it's the other reason, I would just say, God can manage the 70 years somehow. Or, don't give a prophecy of 70 years if this is what you think is coming. If you can do prophecy, you can know that this is happening as well. But I think the real answer is the second one. Had Nebuchadnezzar died or disappeared from his empire in the way of the land, praise of God and publicity of his might would not have resulted. The point is the PR. That's what's supposed to happen here. So that's our story. Now, I want to go back to our opening question. And by the way, I didn't note it in my notes, but just to mention, commentators suggest that there's an added reason for Nebuchadnezzar to send his letter. It isn't only about promoting God, right? There's another element here, which is letting everybody know he's back. Right? I'm back on my throne. He wants to make sure the world knows it. Now, I'm looking at the clock and recognize we only have a couple of minutes. So I want to come back to this. You could have said yes, this is punishment for his barbarity. He was cruel, and now he is a beast. He exiled others, and now he experiences exiles. You could read it that way as measure for measure punishment. But then Isaac of Abarbanel says no. That's not what's going on here. This is not punishment for what he did to the Jews. This is punishment, and we've seen the word a couple of times now, for arrogance. Meaning, people are situated, and this is what I brought you in number 18, but I'm not going to have time to read it inside. People are situated between animals and celestial beings on the ladder of existence. Nebuchadnezzar said, I'm going to be like the angels. I'm going to be like a celestial power. And so he sinks down to the bottom. That's why Abarbanel sees it, and others as well, that it's punishment for being arrogant. Well, then the question is, why not punish him for destroying the temple? Why only punish him for being arrogant? He killed so many people. Why can't you punish him for that? So, if we had more time, I would open this to everybody, but I want to make sure to stick to the program here. So I'll offer two notes. One note is simply, and I think this is what Betty was about to say, there's no atonement for what he had done to us. There you go. You can't atone for what he did. What he did with King Tzidkiyahu, with his sons, and blinding him, what he did to the nation, thousands upon thousands of people, you can't atone for that. This will take care of his personality traits. But he's not getting a makeup for those other things. That's one way to look at it. But I'd like to offer another possibility. The Talmud writes, and I brought it for you in number 19, that the second temple was destroyed as a punishment for our sin of sinat chinam, of baseless hatred, animosity from Jews towards other Jews. The first temple is supposed to be destroyed because of three major sins: idolatry, adultery, and bloodshed. However, when you look in the Talmud, you find there was loads of bloodshed going on between Jews in the second temple as well. You had a group called the Sikari who went around stabbing other Jews who they believed were loyal to the Romans, or in attempts to try to stir up trouble and get the Jews to revolt. Another passage in the Talmud says that they actually stopped having rabbinical courts judge capital cases in the period of the Second Temple because there were so many murders that were going on. It wasn't working. You weren't deterring anything, and they weren't able to carry this out. So what do you mean when you say that it's for baseless hatred? It's a nice idea. But there was murder going on. Why wouldn't we... why that? So Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, makes a comment which I brought you in number 20. He says, the bloodshed that went on in the Second Temple period, as terrible as it was by people who thought they were doing something right. People who thought, these people are collaborating with the Romans. People who thought that person is heretical. They were wrong for what they did, but that isn't going to lead God to bring the destruction of a temple. They'll have to be punished. They're going to have to answer for what they did wrong. But it's not going to lead to Churban, to the destruction of a temple. That's what he writes regarding the destruction of the Second Temple. It's not for the bloodshed that went on, because they were wrong-headed, and they're going to have to pay for it, but not on that scale. I would borrow that idea that he states regarding the Second Temple and apply it to Nevuchadnezzar. As terrible as he is, as beastly as he is, he's doing what empires did. Whether it's Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians, or whether it's Sancherib with the Assyrians, or any king you want to mention in any ancient empire from 2,500 years ago, that was the way they operated. And even though it's terrible, that's not going to warrant that God overturn his empire, because this is what he was brought up to do. This is what his empire wanted him to do, and this is what he thought was appropriate. What he is punished for is the arrogance. That is what God chooses to send him a message about, is the arrogance that he has no justification for. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too kind to Nevuchadnezzar, which is a terrible thing to do. But maybe that's what's going on, and so he has to learn to correct the arrogance of the statue that he had made and his insistence that he would endure forever. I apologize for rushing the ending. You can see the sources that I referred to in 18 through 21. On the source sheets, in particular Barbanel, about this. As always, be in touch with me by email to follow up on comments you wanted to make during the class. I apologize for not having the time for it, but God willing, next week we have a very full agenda with the writing on of the wall. The story of Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's immediate successor or second successor, depending on how we read it, but the story of the feast and the writing on the wall. For those who were at the Heroes and Villains program on December 25th, when I spoke about Belshazzar, this will be a longer version of that, more fleshed out. That was a half-hour session. This one's going to be an hour. So that's the agenda for next week. Thank you very much.